And our next guest is one of my favorite journalists on technology and related issues, and he has a new book on the subject. Yasha Levine is the author of the new book, which I am holding in my hands, Surveillance Valley, The Secret Military History of the Internet. He joins us now. Welcome, Yasha.
Thanks for having me on.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for writing this book, which I consider a very valuable addition to the literature of technology and modern society, and that's saying a lot. Let's start with, I guess, the obvious question: what inspired you to write this book?
Well, it came out of reporting that I was doing on Silicon Valley and Silicon Valley's for-profit surveillance business as I came to see it. A lot of these companies that we use every day, like Google and Facebook, means the lifeblood of their business, really the thing that fuels them is surveillance, right? They make money off targeted advertising, and to make sure that they customize the ads that we see, they want to know us as intimately as possible, right? And so to do that, they collect everything about us, everything that they can, they grab and try to analyze in order to make money. And so when I started digging into this business, I began to realize that what these companies were doing was really not that much different or any different than what the NSA, wants to do with the world, or what the military wants to do with the world. They want to, watch everybody. They want to understand everything. They want to have a kind of total information awareness about the world. And as I got deeper into looking at the symbiotic relationship between the military and Silicon Valley, I also began to understand that surveillance was something that was very intrinsically part of the structure of the internet and the structure of computer technology in general. And I went down this path that led me to discover a hidden history of the internet, a forgotten history about the internet as a surveillance tool, that it was designed to be a surveillance tool from the very beginning, which, when I got into that history, I began to realize that it's the history of the internet is darker than we've been led to believe. And because we've been told a lot of myths about the internet and we've believed them, we've heard a lot about the utopian nature of the technology,
Right. And
the
let's
democratic nature of the technology, and all these things. But it's darker, and it's very much tied to surveillance and control, going back like half a century.
and the myths we're usually told about the internet, or the story we've been led to believe, Yasha Levine, is that it was invented basically by benevolent California hippies in the 70s and 80s, and they took something that scientists were tinkering with. Maybe people know it was associated with the research arm of the Pentagon, but they took this thing and they wanted everybody to have information and information to be free. And then some business people came in and said, let's monetize this. But what your book says to me, based on my understanding of it, is no, actually, the surveillance dimension, the kind of panopticon, or the semi, with all the sinister overtones that the word surveillance has, that really has been part of the technology, the internet, from from its dawn, from its inception. Is that basically right?
Yes, that's the thesis of my book. And look, I mean, there were some people who worked on the ARPANET in the Bay Area who took acid, and they smoked pot and they went to Grateful Dead shows. I mean, that is true, right? But and at the same time, they were military contractors, right? And so these two things are not mutually exclusive, especially given the times. But these guys that were thinking about technology, maybe in a utopian sense, right? They were still working for the military, and they were military contractors, and they were not funding the technology. They were not, arguing for why this technology is necessary. They were the ones who were building it, who were contracted to build it. And so, if you to understand where the internet really came out of, you have to go back to the beginning, to go back to the 1960s, and back then America was this um, expanding global power, a new global power still, and it was facing insurgencies all around the world. It was facing the war in Vietnam, but also conflicts from Latin America to Southeast Asia. And it was also facing, of course, a turbulent domestic situation with anti-war protests, civil rights movements, bombings that were going off almost every day by the Weather Underground. And at the time, in certain military circles, it was believed that America was facing a new kind of threat at the time. It was a new kind of war. It was a global insurgency underwritten by the Soviet Union that was working, to expand globally, but also undermine America domestically. And so this new kind of war could not be fought with traditional armies like tanks, or you couldn't drop a nuke on it to solve the problem. Although a lot of people wanted to do that, because the civilian, the combatant wasn't wearing army fatigues. He wasn't marching in formation. He was part of the civilian population. And so the question was, how do you find the enemy within, right? Whether it's in America or whether it's in rebellious tribes in northern Thailand, right? How do you find out who's rebellious and why, and how do you predict who will rebel next? And so the idea was that for this new kind of war, you needed a new kind of information weapon, right? You needed tools that could ingest a lot of data, process it, data on people, like welfare rolls, criminal histories, economic data on societies that could predict maybe where there would be some kind of strife, or where there would be economic problems. So you could put all that together, analyze it in complex ways, and run it through predictive models, and then hopefully you would have the system that could find the enemy from within. Find the enemy that's hidden in civilian populations and eradicate it, right? And so that's where the internet came out of.
So
that's what ARPA.
Yeah, just to step in for a second. So are you saying that at some point as far back as the 1960s, somebody actually said, or some group of people in the U.S. military actually said, it would be great to have a tool that kind of monitors what people are doing and thinking so that we can spot the troublemakers early?
Yes.
Yeah, and what was that? Was that like a series of research papers, or?
It came from all sorts of. It was in the air. It was so obvious to people, because you have to understand that a lot of people who were working on the ARPANET, the network that became the internet, came out of cut their teeth on SAGE, which SAGE was the first radar defense system that America built, starting in the 1950s to protect America from nuclear attack by air, right? So it could track hostile aircraft and then intercept them with missiles if they were deemed to be hostile. Now that system was, the first national kind of computer network system, because it had radar installations, on the borders and in off the coasts, right? And those things fed into these big IBM computers, and then that information was fed into these workstations where Air Force analysts would be sitting there and monitoring radar defense. And so it was the first computerized surveillance system, surveillance writ large, because you could track things in the real world, right? Use a computer system to track things. And it was, at the time, it was a pretty obvious extension. It's like, if you can do this for aircraft, right? If you can monitor the world for hostile aircraft and figure out, okay, is this hostile or not hostile? If it's hostile, okay, where is it going? How can we intercept it, right? So you can almost predict their behavior into the future, right? Looking at their trajectory. So why can't you do that for people, right? That was a pretty obvious leap. And so there were a lot of symposiums at the time that were talking about how to deal with counterinsurgency, right? And there were a lot of projects, not just in ARPA, which was, now we know it as DARPA, it's the R&D wing of the Pentagon, but the U.S. Army was also carrying out a lot of research in sort of predictive systems for human behavior that it was trying to deploy in Latin America. So yeah, it wasn't like something that was hidden. It was something that was in the air, right? As the way that people talk about big data now is how back then in the 1960s, people talked about sort of predicting, using computer technology to predict future events and predict people's behavior. And I'd like to just point out that while we have lost that aspect of our history, or the history of the network and network technology, back then people understood what this technology was about. Going back to as early as 1969, which is the first year that the ARPANET was turned on. So the ARPANET was turned on in 1969. That same year, there was huge protest in MIT against the ARPANET. And there were these pamphlets and booklets passed out on campus talking about the ARPANET as the beginning of this surveillance network that was going to allow what they called Washington's policemen to better manage the world and to control the world. And so it was obvious to people almost half a century ago what this network was, and we've sort of lost it. It had been really successfully rebranded starting in the 1980s and 1990s into something utopian, whereas
Yeah.
it wasn't
That
that before.
That's really interesting because, I'm old enough to remember I was a kid, but I'm old enough to remember those days. And if you went to the World's Fair or whatever, you would always see, the wired home of the future, the connected home of the future. And you could press a button and talk to your cousin in Cincinnati or whatever, and you'd see their picture on a screen. So I guess it was a logical extension to say, yeah, and we could covertly track all of this too. So let's flash forward to the 80s, and this starts to get modeled as a utopian hippie vision, and not long after that, gets privatized. And you mentioned, I think it's Stephen Wolf,
Hmm.
who agrees that he might be called the guy who privatized the internet. So it gets idealized, and then it gets privatized, and in this process, what we forget its military origins, and the private sector does the military's work for us. Like, take us through that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting history, right? Because I think some people are aware, a lot of people just don't have no clue about where the internet came from. It just sort of magically appeared in the 90s, right? And but if people do have a sense of where it came from, there is a sense that, oh yes, it came out of the Pentagon like a long, long time ago, but of course it's no longer tied to the Pentagon in any way. But there's this, black hole that we have between the 90s and sort of the 70s and the 60s when the internet first was developed, right? Like what happened in those 2 decades. And what astounded me as I started really getting deep into the history of the internet is how little we understand about how the internet was privatized. The internet is arguably the most valuable invention of the 20th century, right? I mean, it's underlies society right now. There's no part of our life that it doesn't touch anymore, right? And it's created these mega billionaires who are like our overlords now, who see everything about us and make so much money. It's unfathomable to us, and have so much power over our political process. These people were created out of this system, right? Out of this telecommunication system, and the system was explicitly privatized by the federal government in starting in the mid 80s and concluding in like 1994. And there were, bureaucrats that were working for the National Science Foundation. That this is where the privatization took place, and there are people who literally privatized the internet. I mean, they privatized the internet, and we don't know about them. We don't know their names. So I was born in the Soviet Union, right? And everyone in Russia today knows the people who privatized their country. They might not know the details of what happened or how it happened, but they know the names. They know some names, and they can put a face to it, right? And they don't like them usually. They're not like they're not revered in the country. But in America, we don't know who privatized the internet. Such a vital and important part of our society today, right? And so I uncover that, and it's a really fascinating story. It's depressing because it shows how easily you could privatize something so valuable, and without anyone really raising alarm or even knowing it was happening. Because at the time, people weren't aware of the internet really. It was just starting to come out of academia. It was just starting to come into people's homes because you needed cheap computers in order to connect to the internet, and so you needed the personal computer revolution to first kind of take hold, right? So people could actually own computers in their home, and it wasn't just connected to their business or to their academic institution. And so it's a really dark story, I think, because it just shows how easily you can be swindled. And then of course that history gets erased because history is always written by the victors, right? Or so the saying goes. And so the victors are Sergey Brin. They are our Silicon Valley oligarchs. And so the history that they wrote for us does not include any of that.
Right. And I think that's very true. And I mean, there are multiple dimensions to it. There's the argument, I think, legitimately to be made that this is a public invention that's been taken for private gain. In that sense, the parallel with the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe is really apt. And there's also the military nature of it and the ongoing threat that poses to our civil liberties. And I guess in the last few seconds we have, Yasha Levine, what would you want people to know about this book?
Well, I think this book is important because in order for us to try to take control and take democratic control over the internet, which is something very important. something we absolutely have to do, and take democratic control not over just the internet, but of technology in general, and try to guide how technology affects our life and our society. We have to do that. We have to know the history of this technology, and so we can't operate based on our sort of utopian, myths that we've been fed. We have to look at the dark and sometimes depressing and aspect of where this technology came from. Because if we don't understand it, we can't have a handle on it, and we can't have a handle on it to do anything about it. So we have to recovering our history, our collective history is extremely important for the future.
Well, and I think that is very well said. And I think the book is extremely well written. Again, the book is Surveillance Valley, The Secret Military History of the Internet. Yasha Levine, thanks for writing it, and thanks for joining us.
Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me on.